So, without further ado, let's turn to the general design roadmap. For present purposes, research design may generally be said to begin with the selection of a particular topic based on one's interests. And based on this topic, it then makes sense to construct a corresponding purpose statement, more on which will be said shortly. Based on one's purpose statement, it then becomes necessary to outline a particular question, hypothesis, or set thereof, and this then leads to the selection of a corresponding methodology. And lastly, with one's methodology in place, the next general steps in research design are data collection and the analysis and dissemination of research findings. So, with that in mind, let's dive a little deeper into each of these steps. As already indicated, research design typically begins with the selection of a general topic of interest. I imagine most of you have already done this, but just for the sake of this workshop, I'm going to go over each step nonetheless. So, to help clarify your topic, it can be helpful to begin by outlining a short summary of whatever it is you're wanting to investigate. And this initial clarity can be further strengthened by considering the value and relevance of your selected topic. For instance, of what value will research into this topic be, and for whom? Furthermore, of what particular relevance is research into this topic? In addition, it's also wise to consider the feasibility of research into this topic up front. For instance, is the scope of this topic manageable and realistic? How much time, energy, and resourcing will be needed to see this topic through? And will it be feasible to access all the relevant data needed for this topic? Furthermore, it also makes sense to reflect on your lived proximity to your topic of interest. For instance, how close are you to the topic both spatially and temporally? Do you or any of your teammates have any lived experience with this topic? What kind of emotional or existential bonds connect you to your topic? Remember, some of the most powerful and compelling research comes from lived proximity to the topic under investigation. And finally, consider the existing level of need for research into this topic. For instance, is there an urgent need for knowledge related to your topic? Where is this need located, and to whom might it correspond? Are there existing gaps in knowledge that urgently need filling? And can this be of service for broader transformation? This, in sum, is the kind of thought and reflection that should ideally inform your initial topic selection. Next, let's do a little unpacking of the purpose statement. Now, once again, I imagine many of you have already gone through this process, either implicitly or explicitly, but once again, just for the sake of this workshop, I'm just going to go through all the steps so we're all kind of on the same page. So, after selecting your topic, a purpose statement allows you to further refine the overarching purpose of your research. This begins by identifying the overriding objectives of your intended project. For instance, will it be primarily exploratory, descriptive, explanatory, evaluative, impact-oriented, or some mix thereof? Toward what specific end or ends will it be conducted? And how might this align with the value, relevance, and needs identified earlier? Once having considered these questions, it's then necessary to zero in on the specific phenomenon under investigation. So within your topic of interest, what specifically will you actually be investigating? Once again, be sure to consider the value, relevance, and feasibility of this phenomenon. And furthermore, strive to be as crisp and concise as possible when establishing its boundaries. To assist in this process, it might be helpful to consider the primary setting of your research. For instance, what is the precise physical, social, cultural, historical, or related context in which your research will be conducted? Likewise, it can also help to identify any of the core variables of your research. For instance, what particular aspects of the phenomenon under investigation are of most interest or relevance for your project. And at this point, it can also be helpful to consider any potential participants or collaborators in your project. For instance, this might include teammates, faculty members, academic mentors, skilled practitioners with relevant insight, and so on. What kind of planning and preparation might be required to make these connections possible? As a side note, also know that for ethical purposes, anyone interviewed or consulted during the course of research must satisfy the official requirements of the Office of Research Ethics, more on which will be said later. And finally, before proceeding further, it's very important to surface any initial arguments, predictions, or assumptions that might be shaping or informing your project. Are there any potential biases at play? And how might these affect your research design? Careful consideration must be given to avoid implicit bias and any potential influences it might have on your project. Next, having identified a topic and outlined a corresponding purpose statement, you should now be ready to develop a specific question, hypothesis, or set thereof. Given the open systemic context in which Math the System occurs, i.e. that of the quote-unquote real world, where variables cannot be neatly isolated or predictably controlled, it stands to reason that hypotheses, which are classically more closely associated with experimental research, might be less relevant than in other instances. However, that being said, those wanting to test or explore particular hypotheses or hunches can still do so in the form of questions. In the end, it all hinges on how you frame it. When designing research questions, perhaps the most important factor to consider is whether they are indeed researchable. Here one must be very conscious of one's framing and how it influences the corresponding scope and feasibility of research. Furthermore, it's also important to ensure that research questions accurately and concisely capture the very heart of what it is you're seeking to investigate. Remember the popular quote attributed to Einstein: "If I had an hour to solve a problem, I'd spend 55 minutes thinking about the problem and 5 minutes thinking about solutions." The same holds for research questions. In addition, any questions developed for research should reflect your initial topic and purpose statement, thereby enhancing the internal coherence of your project. And in case of multiple questions, it can be helpful to distinguish between primary and secondary questions, the former of which constitute the primary focus of research, and the latter of which require ancillary data. Finally, it's also important to note that questions inevitably influence the ensuing shape of research. So do keep this in mind as you move ahead. Now, once again, given where we are currently at in the competition, I imagine many of you have already selected your topics, clarified your purpose, and outlined guiding questions for your projects. However, I'd like to take a moment to highlight a useful tool that can be of great use in guiding and orienting you through Math the System, namely the Impact Gaps Canvas. Derived from the research of Daniela Papi-Thornton, it can be used by anyone who wants to understand the landscape of a problem and possibly some paths to potential solutions. So on the left-hand side are questions that can assist in mapping the problem landscape. That is, who or what is impacted, what is holding the status quo in place, and who might be affected when it is transformed. To what other issues is this problem related? What is the history of the problem? And so on. And then on the right-hand side are questions that can assist in mapping the solution landscape. For instance, what has already been tried? What has worked and what hasn't? How have these efforts connected and built upon each other? What future efforts are currently being planned? And so on. And then in the middle is the so-called impact gap. Here you can explore from a high-level perspective by asking questions such as, what's missing in the solutions landscape? What could better connect existing efforts? What regulation might be needed? What lessons can be shared? And so on. Or you could explore gaps in more detail by asking questions like, why have certain efforts failed or succeeded? What gaps are obstructing better solutions? How can existing models be tweaked to improve impacts for greater numbers? And so on. All in all, this is an extremely useful tool for guiding and orienting the initial steps of research design. Hence, for those of you interested in learning more, I definitely encourage you to Google it and see what value it could add to your project. Next comes the selection of an appropriate methodology. So given the limited scope of this workshop, I won't go into much detail here. Suffice it to say that qualitative, quantitative, mixed methods, and community-based approaches can all be equally relevant for Math the System. It all depends on the question you're asking and the corresponding reality under investigation. In the table presented here, I've given a brief summary of these approaches and their corresponding genres and methods. So, for instance, genres associated with the quantitative approach are usually experimental and survey-based, whereas those associated with the qualitative approach are usually based on interviews, fieldwork, or various unobtrusive methods. Mixed methods, on the other hand, tend to combine features of both qualitative and quantitative research, whereas community-based approaches are generally concerned with broad inclusivity and participatory action. So for more specific insight into any of these approaches or their associated genres and methods, please be proactive in seeking out relevant guidance from faculty members, academic mentors, librarians, and others capable of leading you in the right direction. After having selected an appropriate methodology, next comes the step of data collection. It's here that research really comes to life and the rubber finally hits the road. Once again, I won't go into too much detail here. Suffice it to say that data collection can be facilitated through both primary and secondary research, the former of which is self-conducted and the latter of which is gathered from pre-existing sources. Importantly, primary research is generally very cost, time, and labor intensive, whereas secondary research is generally the opposite. Hence, as a general rule of thumb, primary research should usually only be conducted to fill in gaps following extensive secondary research, whereas secondary research should be leveraged as much as possible to avoid redundant primary research. Now, when gathering data, sources can be further classified as either primary, secondary, or tertiary. Primary sources are generally first-hand records that provide direct data on your selected topic, such as original documents, creative works, and artifacts. Secondary sources are derivative records based on secondary evaluations of primary sources, such as essays, articles, monographs, and the like. And finally, tertiary sources generally provide condensed overviews of both primary and secondary sources, such as in meta-analyses and encyclopedia entries. At the end of the day, each of these categories could be of relevance depending on your project. Once again, for more specific guidance, please be proactive in seeking relevant instruction. Lastly, there is the final step of analysis and dissemination. So for Map the System, this will finally involve 4 distinct deliverables, namely a written analysis of 3,000 words, a detailed bibliography of all sources consulted, a visual systems map, and a verbal storytelling presentation. So for more information on each of these deliverables and how you should be focusing your efforts to satisfy each of their requirements, please consult the Student Resources section of the Map the System Canada website. And furthermore, to see examples of final deliverables from previous finalists, feel free to visit the Map the System tab under the Center for Peace Advancement website, where you'll be able to find submissions from 2019 and 2020. These can be really helpful in guiding and informing your efforts.